Let's have a look at some of the ones that we've got here then. So first of all, and this is, I think, something that Afsan mentioned, was the use of complex language. So normally, and again, I don't know, a lot of people don't bother reading contracts, even though we sign lots of them. You know, you've got to, if you use Facebook, for example, there's actually a contract that you enter into before you're allowed to use that social media. If you've got a mobile phone, there'll be a mobile phone contract that governs the use. And we are supposed to read those when we get them before we sort of tick the box or sign them. But a lot of people don't, myself included. I have to hold my hand up and say that actually a lot of the time when I'm filling something online, I just want access to a website or to something, I won't always read it in detail. I don't always have time to skim to the bottom and tick it to say you've read it, even though you haven't. But we should do. But certainly if you do sit down to actually read one, you will notice that the language used is different, as Afsan said, to sort of normal everyday language. It's different from picking up an article in a magazine or a novel or even a newspaper article. The way that it's written and the terms that are used and the grammar are different for legal documents, because they have to be very clear, so that there can be no ambiguity about what they are saying. In addition to that, the register is normally quite high, so it can be difficult to understand. Do you remember from previous sessions what we mean by register? Anyone can answer that?
High standard of language, or use it in a high level.
Yeah, so that's absolutely true, but it's also as well the degree of formality that's used, so how formal a text is. So normally when it's a legal document, it will be very, very formal, as we'll see later. Another characteristic of a legal document is for the average person like myself, it can be time consuming to read and understand. It is possible, if you read a lot of contracts, to sort of get your head into the way that they're written, and therefore you can look at them and go through them a lot easier, and you'll find them easier to read and understand. But certainly if you don't do that very often, or you've never done it before, if you start sitting down, you could read a paragraph quite easily and get to the end of it and think, what on earth was that about? I'm going to have to read that again to try and understand what it means, because yeah, it does take a lot of time to get used to that register and that form of language. And not only that, but they use archaic or old terms that you don't really see anywhere else used in language anymore. So the kind of things you might come up across on a legal document can be something like hereinafter, which means here and there, subsequent to, which is after, or prior to, which is before, pursuant to, which means under. You might see lessee, which is tenant. So there's all these different words that are not normally used in day-to-day conversation, but you will come across them in contracts quite a lot, or in legal documents. In addition to that, it's not difficult enough, they tend to use long sentences. So not just complex languages, but long sentences as well. And generally, if you're reading a document, it's got long, complex sentences all the way through. That, again, is a clue that it's a legal document that you're looking at there. The use of the passive voice. What do we mean by the use of the passive voice? Does anyone know that? So as opposed to the active voice. Oh, Araz, you've got your hand up. I didn't see it. Sorry.
Sorry, before that, just I've got a question. If you can I cannot say a comment. If you can send some of examples of that, please, and we just like to read it.
Of which bit? The archaic terms or the sentences? Or
the sentences, please, and we can say an example or a template of a legal term.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I could find a lot, but if you look at any contract you've got, you will see exactly what I mean by that. If you look at, like I say, if you've got a mobile phone contract anywhere, they're normally emailed out now, then have a look at that. If you want to look at things like the terms and conditions of a website, or that you use, like social media, for example, they will generally use them. So there's loads of examples that you can find out there, and certainly to help you to get used to reading those, it's recommended that you seek these out and actually spend some time looking into them. Even to a certain extent, the code of conduct that we spoke about a few weeks ago, if you look at the NRPSI code of conduct, it's not quite a legal document, but some of it is written in that sort of style. So sometimes you can read a paragraph and have to sort of read it again to fully understand what it means, just because it's stated almost in the same kind of language. But yeah, passive voice is sort of an impersonal style of writing. So it's not a familiar way of writing. It refers to people, for example, instead of you and I would refer to each other. You know, it might be the defendant or the contract holder or the I can't think of any now. The party, the legal party, or the organization, things like that, and it turns to those. So the organization agrees to do this, this, and this, instead of saying, you know, someone out there or this company, and they'll refer to it in those ones. So again, that can be a clue as well. Normalisation, nominalization is the use of nouns instead of verbs. So instead of having the verbs to consider, it would say to give consideration, or instead of then to oppose, to be in opposition. So again, it's that kind of use of the, again, more complex language than you'd expect and day-to-day texts. There's also what's called borrowing, which is the use of foreign words derived from French or Latin. So, for example, gone past there. I've got some examples written down. So there's words such as versus, prosa, impropria persona, which is all Latin. You've also got things like court, damage, default, defendant, which are all from French borrowing. So again, you find a large number of foreign terms which are used in legal contracts, whereas again, a lot of those terms have fallen out of use in day-to-day language. We've also got the synonymy, I can't say this word, synonymy, which is like using synonyms. So if you remember to previous sessions when we've talked about synonyms, it's essentially using a number of synonyms referring to the same thing. So again, you might have words like assign instead of transfer, or breach, which is violation instead. Instead of clause, you might talk about provisions. Paragraphs are referred to as articles. Defaults referred to as failure, and lessee, as I've already mentioned, as tenants. So again, it's getting used to, and this is where practice and looking into these documents is really useful for yourselves, practicing to do this, because it's getting used to the way that they use these words. And these words and terms do come up again and again and again. So if you look at one contract, they'll probably use some of these sort of terms and ways of speaking and the use of the passive voice. The more you look at, you'll find there's a lot of repetition in that. So you'll come across certain terms that keep repeating themselves throughout things like contracts. It's like I said before, that here within and words like that, you do start to get used to them the more contracts that you look into.